The great palace floated high above the clouds of the capital world. Its towers shone like rivers of glass, and its long halls glittered like starlight. In these halls, Princess Eleanor sat on her silver chair, looking out across a crowd of noblemen who had come to ask for her hand. Suitor after suitor stepped forward, dressed in silks trimmed with gold or in uniforms heavy with medals of battles fought and won. They brought jewels mined from asteroids, ships fast enough to travel across galaxies, and promises made in loud voices. Every man spoke of glory, wealth, and victory. They promised her worlds. They spoke of her beauty and how she would shine beside them. They spoke of how her name would be carried in legends if she chose them. But when they were finished, Eleanor only smiled kindly and said, "Thank you." Then she gestured for the next man to step forward. She listened to them all, but her heart felt tired. Though their words sounded grand, all of them spoke of themselves rather than her. They loved the crown more than the woman. Her heart longed for something she could not yet say in words. Each suitor left his vow behind as if it were a jewel, but in her eyes those vows faded like dust. The entire court grew restless. They whispered to each other that Eleanor was proud. Some even said she was cold. Still, the princess did not choose any of them. The king worried for her. The queen whispered that time was running past. The great empire had to be joined through marriage, for old custom demanded it. Yet Eleanor stood firm in silence. She knew she had to wait for the right voice, the right heart, though she did not know when it would come. And then came Daniel. He was not a lord, nor a wealthy admiral. He was a simple man who worked with machines in the mining colonies far away. He had no great riches. His suit was plain, clean but plain, without jewels or glitter. The council nearly laughed when they heard his name. One advisor even said, "How can this man stand among the great ones?" But tradition was strong and the law was clear. Every man could speak his vow before the princess if he asked for her hand. When Daniel stepped forward through the line of nobles, the room was filled with whispers. His head was bowed, his steps careful on the marble floor. His voice was quiet, so quiet that the council leaned forward just to hear his first words. The princess lifted her hand, silencing the room. Others might see a poor suitor, but Eleanor's eyes saw something different. She looked not at his clothes or jewels, for he had none, but she looked at his face and found no pride, no empty boasting. She did not yet know what he would say, only that for the first time her heart waited with hope. The long days of noble parades continued, and with every passing week, the palace grew more restless. Princes from far cities came with glowing jewels and treasures to spread before the throne. Scholars recited clever words that reached high into the air like towers of glass. Admirals promised half their fleets to the empire and bowed with stiff pride. Yet the princess gave them all the same polite smile and returned the same answer. There was no fire in her eyes, no spark of trust in her voice, for she knew that these offerings were not for her, but for her crown. The nobles at court whispered louder each day. Some said Eleanor was selfish. Others said she was waiting for a man richer than the rest. The truth was far simpler. She wanted to be seen as herself, not as a jewel to be added to another man's crown. Far away in the dark rim colonies where the palace glitter could only be seen as a faint star, Daniel worked quietly with his hands. He was a mechanic in the mines. His world was sweat, broken tools, and humming machines that cried out for repair. He lived with men and women who knew hard labor, who had more scars than gold. He did not dream of palaces or princesses. He dreamed only of finishing each day with honest work and sharing bread with his friends. One evening his elder brother visited him after a long shift. His brother had always been the sort who spoke of grand fates. He slapped Daniel gently on the back and said, "They say the princess hears vows from every man who asks. Why not you? What do you lose by standing in that hall?" Daniel laughed at first, thinking it nothing but a fool's game. Me? Among nobles with bright ships and heavy purses? I wear grease on my hands and dust in my lungs. What would I offer her? His brother only shook his head. The truth. You would offer her the truth. That alone may be worth more than what the nobles can carry in their shining chests. The thought stayed with Daniel like a hidden ember. Days later, when travel ships came to the colonies, Daniel gathered his courage and joined the long line bound for the capital. He carried nothing but his plain suit, his rough hands, and a heart that had never learned to lie. When he finally entered the palace, the courtiers laughed behind their hands. They could not believe this man stood among them. Some even muttered insults, wishing to push him back to the shadows. But the princess, who had grown weary of jewels and fleets, lifted her hand and silenced the crowd. She wanted to hear him. She wanted to see if behind those quiet eyes lay something the others lacked. And though no one yet knew it, Daniel's step into that shining hall would change the course of her choice forever. Daniel stood quietly in the grand chamber when his turn finally came. The long rows of nobles rolled their eyes and folded their arms as if waiting for a dull moment that would soon pass. The princess sat on her silver chair. Though her crown gleamed with hundreds of little lights, her expression was calm as still water. She looked at the man with plain clothes. The man who had no precious stones in his hands. The man who shifted his weight nervously like someone unused to such a place. Daniel bowed his head and began to speak. His voice was low but steady, not filled with grand words or promises of power. He spoke about the places where he had lived. He told of the dark stone tunnels of the mining colonies, where men and women worked dawn to dusk to keep their families alive. He told of nights when the machines broke down, and neighbors came together with simple tools and rough hands to mend what they could. He told of friendships born in hunger, when laughter was a gift greater than food. He did not try to praise himself. He only painted a picture of people who struggled and still managed to sing. "I cannot offer great fleets," Daniel said. "Cannot give crowns or armies. What I can give is this. I can carry a burden when it grows too heavy. I can sit when the silence feels lonely, and I can lift joy when it seems too small. I will not build empires, but I will guard your happiness with all that I am." For a moment the chamber grew still. The noblemen blinked in disbelief at the simplicity of his speech. Some scoffed, whispering to one another that such words were weak and unworthy of a princess. One man shook his head with an arrogant smile. "Out!" But Eleanor leaned forward. Her lips curved into something so rare that even her own council gasped, for it was a true smile, light and unforced. Her laugh, soft and gentle, broke the heavy air like morning after a long night. The words had touched her in a way no jeweled gift ever could. She had listened to hundreds who promised her power, who promised glory, who swore that they could guard her throne with fleets and fire. Yet none of them had promised to guard her heart. Daniel lowered his eyes again, almost shy. "I know others can give you more, princess. And if you choose one of them, I will still leave with peace. Because I have spoken the truth." The court stared, unsure of whether to be amused or insulted. To them it was madness that a common man could speak so plain and still stand in the same hall as dukes and lords. But the princess knew at once that she had heard something she had been yearning for all along. Her gaze remained fixed on him long after he finished speaking, as though his words had unlocked a hidden door in her soul. And from that moment, she began to wonder if the journey of her heart had at last found its first real step. The court was in an uproar after Daniel spoke. Many nobles could not hide their anger. They muttered to each other, their voices sharp with scorn. Some claimed he had mocked the tradition. Others said he had insulted the throne by bringing such humble words into the chamber of kings. Yet the princess only sat quietly, her eyes still thoughtful, as if she carried Daniel's words close to her heart. The king saw the storm rising and understood that peace would not return unless he called for order. He stood and raised his hand for silence. His voice was strong and steady as he said that every suitor would take part in a trial. No one could win the princess, only with fine words. Each man would now prove his worth, not with promises, but with deeds. At this command, a murmur spread like fire through the crowd. The nobles were eager, for they believed their wealth and skill would help them shine brighter than a poor miner. They rushed at the challenge, already plotting the great displays they would create. When the day of trial came, the palace grounds turned into a stage of spectacle. Lords commanded huge machines that roared through the sky. Admirals displayed rows of shining soldiers and weapons that glowed blue with energy. One noble even ordered a fleet of drones to paint the air with colors of fire and song. The people who had gathered gasped in wonder, dazzled by noise and brilliance. But there was one test among all that seemed unimportant to the wealthy men. A group of engineers announced that in one corner of the capital, a life support system was failing. The machines were old and weak, the air grown foul in the homes of poor families. It was asked of one man to go there and repair what was broken. No suitor wanted the task, for it offered no glory and no performance before the court. Finally, the lot was given to Daniel. Without hesitation, he accepted. He traveled through the crowded streets to the quiet district, where tired mothers and weary children waited to breathe clean air again. Daniel rolled up his sleeves, found the broken filters, and worked through the long night. He used only his hands, his tools, and his patience. When water pumps failed, he carried water with the children. When pipes leaked, he knelt on the floor and sealed them one by one. At dawn, the system came alive at last, with a steady hum. The air grew clear, and the faces of the children lit with joy. They clapped their hands and sang his name out of simple gratitude. Daniel did not announce his success with drums or banners, but the joy of the families was louder than any fleet of machines. While the nobles showed power to impress a crown, Daniel had given himself to heal what was broken. This act, small to many, was greater in meaning than the grand parades of light. And though he returned weary and covered in grease, the princess's eyes shone when she heard what he had done. The great hall was filled from wall to wall when the time came for the princess to make her choice. Nobles stood proud in their decorated clothes, each certain that he had proven himself greater than the rest. The council waited with pens ready to write a record of history. The king and queen sat tall, their faces calm though their hearts were restless. At the center of it all, Princess Eleanor stepped forward. She moved with quiet strength, her gown flowing like sunlight through glass. When she turned her face to the crowd, the noise of whispers fell away, and the chamber grew still. Every suitor held his breath, waiting to hear his name spoken above all others. For each man believed his show of fleets and machines, his golden science had captured her heart. The princess began to speak, her voice soft but clear. She told the hall that she had listened carefully to hundreds of words, to 1,000 promises. Brave men had spoken, rich men had spoken, wise men had spoken. They had offered wealth and land, ships and armies. They had offered fame written in the stars. And yet, she said, none of this touched her soul. None, until one voice spoke without pride. One voice that did not think of crowns or battles, but of burdens shared and joys protected. She turned her eyes toward Daniel, who stood at the far edge of the hall, still in his plain suit, hands rough, head lowered as if expecting nothing. A gasp rolled through the chamber, for many had never imagined such a choice. The nobles struggled to keep their faces steady, anger brewing in their eyes, but Eleanor's voice continued strong. This man worked not for a crown, she said, but for the people who could give him nothing in return. Where others brought power, he brought kindness. Where others brought noise, he brought truth. I will not take the man with the loudest wealth. I will take the man with the truest heart. She stepped down from her silver chair and walked straight across the chamber to Daniel. He looked up in surprise as she placed her hand gently in his. In that touch, there was no weight of duty, only the promise of two souls joined. The common people cheered, their voices rising in joy that spread through the palace windows and out into the busy streets. Oh! Children who had breathed clean air because of Daniel's work now shouted his name with pride. To them he was already a hero, though he had never asked to be one. The court had no choice but to accept the will of their princess. The king, though silent at first, bowed his head with slow approval. The queen smiled with quiet relief. And the nobles, though defeated, could not undo the truth. From that day forward, songs told of Princess Eleanor, who refused 1,000 suitors, and Daniel, the humble man who won not with gold or fire, but with honesty and care. Their story traveled across the great worlds as a reminder that power fades, riches break and fleets grow old, but the light of a true heart never dies.